Good morning. Happy Father's Day to actually everyone, those who are fathers and those who have ever had or have a father. So I guess that includes all of us. After hearing the very inspiring videos that we had and the special music and then the hymns, I feel basically everything has been said. You've heard it. So that's a lot of my material is in that very inspiring music. So I'll try to maybe add a few points to help uh, amplify what this day means and different aspects of it. Some of the I didn't have a particular title for the message other than a Father's Day message that kind of keeps it kind of broad perhaps, and maybe some of the points will be somewhat broad, but I just want to share some of the thoughts I've had on Father's Day and maybe some that you have as well, to just kind of focus in on some of the, I think, the vital elements of what this day means. For instance, what is it like to be a father for those who have been through that, have had that experience? Think about that. And what it's like to have a father. We can look to our fathers who are with us now or in the past and look at the things that we admired, that we respected. I know in my case, I looked at my father probably with more praise and honor and respect than any man in my life. And so I'm very thankful that I've had a father like that. So when I look to God as a father, I get a pretty good image on a physical comparison. Uh, I know not everyone has been blessed with having a father that they can maybe say those same things about. So we're trying to look at father from just the physical as well as above all the spiritual element. And we'll look and ask the question and answer, hopefully, why is God called our Father? This is definitely, I'm not going to try to get into any kind of a deep discussion or theological proof of the different persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But we'll talk about God as our Father and see if we can relate to God as we relate to fathers on a physical level. First of all, let's look at a little bit about what it means to be a father. I read a book by Tim Russert. His first book he wrote was called Big Russ and Me. It was about his father. He wrote it back about 2004. And Tim Russert actually is probably a pretty well-known name, although he passed away a few years ago. He went to school, became an attorney, and in fact, the first person in his family that ever went to college, and was an attorney for some pretty high-level senators and people in Washington, and eventually became the host of the NBC program Beat the Press for 16 years, longer than anyone else. So this book, Big Russ and Me, was about his father, and he shared all the ups and downs and the things that he remembered and had such an impact on his life by talking about his father. And after this book was out for a couple of years, he started getting thousands and thousands of responses from people. Over 60,000 letters were written to him, and people wanted to share with him also the experiences they had with their fathers. And so he was so moved and inspired by all these letters, all these different accounts that people wrote, men, women, every profession you could possibly imagine, and he categorized them into different categories, fathers and daughters, and fathers and honor, and hard work, and all these different categories. And he came out with a book called, probably can't say it, there it is, Wisdom of Our Fathers. That's a compilation of a few hundred, perhaps, of those 60,000 letters that he wrote. And when I read this book just recently, and I was so moved by it, I really took my time through it because there were so many stories that resonated with me. And I'm sure it resonated with a lot of other people too. And I often think that no person should be allowed to be a father until they've read this book and understand a lot of the things that are important to not just the fathers, but to the children growing up and what they're learning and the impact they're having by their father. So I'm going to do probably do a few references from his book as I cover the material today. In fact, I want to cover something from read a little bit of the introduction to this latest book, The Wisdom of Our Fathers, and what prompted him to write this book and why he was so moved by it. He says, starting out in the introduction, people often say that having a child changes your life. And of course, they're right. But it's hard to understand what that really means until it happens to you. In my pre-father years, I was a driven man in a hurry. Then he goes on to explain how he advanced from being an attorney into some pretty high positions and an executive at NBC and his host for the program for many years. This, of course, some of this happened after he had a child. But he says before he had a child, he would say, when I saw someone bringing in an infant on an airplane and all that equipment, I regarded as an inconvenience and would think, come on, let's get this plane in the air. And so he didn't have a lot of patience for kids and all the stuff that went on in handling children, especially on an airplane. That's before he had his own son. But when my son Luke was born, I suddenly understood the meaning of unconditional love. I knew exactly why my father had worked 2 full-time jobs for 30 years. My love for Luke was natural, complete, and instinctive. My career became secondary to the blessing of being a father. I wanted to stay home to feed our baby, watch him learn to crawl, and say his first words. I wanted to coach his baseball and soccer games. I sometimes feel as if I can remember every day of my father's life. Well, there's a man who is really impacted by his son to be able to say that. And it continues on. Of course, there have been some painful moments along the way. He talks about leaving Luke at college in Boston and trying to give him some last minute advice and the emotional impact of that. And what it felt like driving away, ending a major chapter in both of their lives at that time. And it kind of reminds me when I dropped my son off at college, at the airport, and then coming back and seeing the basketball court or a little basketball hoop hanging on the driveway. The net was all kind of tattered. And it just brought, that experience home to me as well. It was, sure, he came back and lived with us for a while, but that was a pivotal moment and a new beginning for all of us and an ending in a way as well. And he says, just finishing up this intro, he says, I hope I've taught him to make good decisions and I've given him a strong foundation to do the right thing. When my life is over, I know the most important thing I'll be judged on is what kind of father I was. Now, that's a powerful statement to say that. Maybe that's not the most important thing we'll be judged on in our lives, but for a person to say that shows the impact and the weight of being a parent, being a father, being a mother really is when we think of it in those terms. Something we, of course, take very seriously when we think that way. A few personal thoughts of being a father. The first evidence of being a father, of course, was when my daughter was born. I knew 9 months what was going to happen. I didn't know exactly what it was going to feel like, look like, or anything else. But until that point, until the birth took place, I wasn't really a father, but then I was. I saw the miracle, and I saw all 3 of my children born in home, live births, and all safe and sound, and everything went well. But to see my daughter just before she was actually saw her face, I even knew that she was a girl. We didn't know the sex of any of our children before they were born. And I saw they had crowning, black hair, moist, and he said, "Is it alive?" Then the head turned, and I said, "Yep, he is. It is." Then just a few seconds later, I realized we found out it was a girl. And to me, that if you don't believe in God or the miracle and the creativity of God and the power and the wisdom or the existence of God, I don't. This would do it. I don't know what else would if this would not do it. Because how can this life come from virtually nothing something we can't even see. So that was my first experience of being a father. And priorities really got rearranged at that time of what it meant. This was a lifetime experience, and it still is. And hopefully this afternoon we'll have some time to visit my daughter and grandkids and just carry on that fatherhood experience. And so I think a lot of us could maybe agree with this as well. The greatest challenge that I've ever had in my life was raising children, especially teenage children. Or the twos were interesting as well. Every phase is really interesting, and all three of my children have been different. So each phase was different, some more difficult than the others, some really easy. But I found raising a teenage daughter, early teen, was very, very challenging. And somehow I lived through it. At the time, it didn't seem like it's just ever going to pass where we survived this, but we did. So that's my overall feeling of being a parent as far as the weightiness of it. It's definitely is not easy. And you might compare it to, in one sense, it's a little different experience of marriage. The responsibility and the weightiness of marriage is certainly not an easy thing, and no one gives you all the easy answers. But the difference is comparing. We meet our spouse as adults. We begin our life together as adults. It's a different experience. With children, we start at the very beginning, from the first minute, and experience changes, goes on, actually, as long as we're all alive. So that's my overall feeling as far as the weightiness of being a father. I suppose each of us could write a book about all the experiences we had with our children, the things we've learned, and things we wish we had known before we went through all the various stages with our children. I took a college course and in dating and marriage, and then child rearing. And I said, well, this is easy. It's all I took good notes. It's all in the book here. This shouldn't be that bad. And of course, they didn't give us a lot of information, and they didn't share us all the ups and downs. It's not a simple textbook, 10 points and you do this and your child will be just right. And if you spank them off enough, everything's gonna be perfect, or whatever the things that we had to learn that either worked or did not work. So we could each share our experiences and probably could take the rest of the time and start going around and say, what did you learn from raising children or having children, and from being a parent or a father? So I want to go on to, I think this obviously is the most important comparison I'm going to be making today, and the message is, why is God called a father? Again, as I mentioned, it's not going to be a theological explanation of the Father as part of the Trinity, but rather the way Jesus used it. And if you want the best source in the Bible to go to, who knows about what it's like to have a father, who was God, is God at the time, and referred to God as his father, well, the expert would be Jesus. We don't have to go to too many other heavy volumes and do a whole lot of research to get an understanding of what Jesus was trying to get across to us, and what it was like to have a father on earth. And there's, of course, a lot of places in the Bible we can probably all recall, where God is referred to as the Father, where Jesus referred to God as his Father. Remember, he taught back in Matthew 6, when they asked him how to pray. He says, pray this way, our Father who is in heaven, our Father. So he's referring to God, obviously, as a father to all human beings, as well as himself. And we can look at among the last words on the cross, when Jesus is giving his life for us, Luke 23:46, he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Just think about that for a minute. Commit your life into another person's hands. What kind of trust is that? There is no deeper trust. And Jesus, too, knowing that he was going to pass from life to That's all he's ever known was life, spiritually, physically, and now he was going to die. All of that was put into God's hands and his trust. Mark 14:36, come across a term that Jesus used in praying to his Father that is just, it shows the incredible relationship that he had with his Father. He starts out saying in, this is Mark 14:36, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Abba. As far as I know, that's the only place in the Bible that term was used, especially Jesus using it, referring to God. And Abba was used back then, it's used today as a very familiar, intimate form of a child addressing their father. Some say it's like Papa or Daddy, but to hear Jesus say that at this severe time of suffering, the time just before he was to die, he says, Abba, Daddy, then Father. What a close relationship. So he knew what it was like to be a father or a son physically. And he knew, of course, what it was like to be a son spiritually. Again, absolute trust. So when our children address us, Daddy, Dad, there's an element of trust there. It's intimate. It's so familiar. It's so, it says a lot more than just Father. Father comes across perhaps as respectful, yes, maybe a little too formal. And so most children probably don't call their fathers father and talking to them on a regular basis. But it's Daddy, just like Jesus calls his Father. I want to move into probably one of the most profound messages or certainly a parable that Jesus gave, what it was like to be a father, what God is like, if you want to compare him to a physical father. That's, of course, the parable of the two sons. Sometimes it's called parable of the prodigal son. And that term a lot of times is replaced with parable of a loving father. Because it's, as the parable starts out in Luke 15:11, it says, a man had two sons. Well, there's two sons involved here. I'm not going to go into the story completely of both sons, but it's not just about the one who went off and, wasted his inheritance, but the other son was involved as well. And if we read the whole parable, the father had interaction with both of them. He loved them both equally. And even at the end, when he talked to the second son, the older son, who refused to come in and celebrate with the return of the young son, the father had to go out and say, everything I have is yours. I love you just as much. And here he was, reconciling the family. That's what fathers do as well, don't they? And notice it's oftentimes the emphasis is put on the prodigal son. It's the main character is the father. Well, the sons are involved, and there's some lessons to be learned, as we'll see, relative to why he even gave this, and speaking to the Pharisees and the sinners. But the father is the main character because this is so extravagant, what this father did. And that's another term for prodigal, extravagant, lavish, not just a negative term, but a positive term, and how much love this father had, which was unheard of, especially in the society at that time. So I read this over. I don't know how many times I read this over. I've given Bible studies and different messages on different aspects of it before. So I'm not going to try to go through and, enumerate and describe all the different points involved. And sometimes it's, you can go and take too many things and try to make too many allegories and meanings out of little aspects of a parable that are really not intended. There's two or three things that stood out for me that I want to share. And a couple of them I think I probably never really thought about before. just kind of popped out. So this is kind of maybe something new for me, and maybe it's new for you as well. But there are important elements that that Jesus was showing this parable that actually illustrate what as a father I should be, and what God as our Father is. The first point that I want to share here is in Luke 15:11 through 12. It says, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So how could this son do that? I mean, it was even asking that was unheard of. It was just totally disrespectful. In fact, in some cases, children could be disinherited, or even worse, for asking a living father, "Give me my inheritance now. I don't want to wait until you die. Hurry up, give me my money." Totally disrespectful. Totally was not done, out of character, and yet this father accepted. So the point here that I'm saying here is the father was approachable. If the son didn't have a fair amount of confidence, his father was even going to listen to him and maybe even consider doing what he was asking, giving me my share of the estate, he wouldn't have done it. He would have been really probably scared for his life to do it. But the fact says the father was approachable. So I had to look back on my life and ask, was I always approachable with my family, my children? And am I still that way? This is obviously a characteristic of God, a quality of God. He's approachable. We can always approach a God and ask and say just about anything, right? And he doesn't. He listens. He doesn't destroy us. So the son was pretty sure of what the father's response would be by going up, even asking this. So that's a particular quality that the father had. Because, the father didn't come back and ask, "Well, why do you need this money? Why are you doing this? This doesn't make sense." And give him a long lecture why you can't do this. You're going to waste it and blow it. The father probably already knew that. He knew his son pretty well. Probably knew what the consequences of giving this inheritance to him at this point in time. I think my own father, as far as being approachable, he was always that way. He wasn't a man of a lot of words. He never lectured me a lot. He didn't have to. It was always a few words, a sentence at an appropriate time. And I got the message, got the impact. And whenever I wanted to talk to him, his whole total attention was on with me. His eye contact especially was right there. It's like there was nobody else in the room, nobody else around, no matter what little thing it was. "Dad, can I have a dime?" Or, "Can you help me with something on the car?" He was there right with me. Just, again, that's a challenging thing that I have to remember, still do today. I got grandkids and got kids too that have, but as far as a father, that's, I think, one of the qualities that a father needs to have, being easily approachable, so they can listen and consider the needs of their children. God's that way. We know that. And I want to read just a short excerpt again from Tim Russell's book. This particular just a short experience that someone had, and they wrote in, wanted to share. And the title of this particular little segment was called "The Comforter." That's maybe one chapter he had was letters and stories that filled this title of "The Comforter." And the person writing in says, "When I was a little girl and my father put me to bed, it would always be cold in the room, especially the sheets, and he would wrap my feet in my baby blanket to keep them warm. Before he kissed me, I had a litany of things I went through every night. I would ask him, 'Can I call you if I need anything? Can I call you if I get hot? Can I call you if I get cold? Can I call you if I get scared? Can I call you if I get hungry?' Every night she'd go this whole list just to be sure. And he would listen and say yes after each one. And I would fall asleep secure that I was completely loved and cared for." That's what we can expect from God. Will you always be with me in all these different situations? He says yes. It's like one of the songs we had, or maybe it was in the message that we just heard in before this, at the beginning of the service here. So God is always with us through everything that we go through, every need, every trial. So God is always approachable. Another thing that I kind of stood out as well, which I had not really thought about in this particular parable, it's in the 13th verse of Luke 15. It says, the son got together all he had and set off for a distant country. And there he squandered his wealth in wild living. Okay, what's so new about that? Well, the fact that the father basically allowed him to make a mistake, a huge mistake. And God allows us to make mistakes. We've had to allow our children to make mistakes sometimes. I know I've had a tendency in raising my children, especially my daughter maybe, and would be overprotective. And someone, you may have seen this, some of us older folks who on Facebook, or I get an email, and it's been around so many, many times. It says, those of us who were born in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it goes through a whole list of things that we all relate to. You know, we drank out of the hose, we would check, leave home at morning, and parents didn't worry about it as long as we got home before dinner time. After reading all these things, I could never allow my children that much liberty. I would be too scared, too nervous about their welfare. And ride my bike to school sometimes when I was 5 or 6 years old, walk sometimes and by myself, a mile to school, and in snow, uphill all the way, or whatever it was. But these are things that some of us older ones relate to, and the subsequent generations, we became more protective, and I know I was as well. But we were allowed to make mistakes, and I made my share of them. Because a parent can't protect a child from every adversity. And God chooses not to protect us from every adversity either, every mistake. I said, what was I thinking when I did that or said that? God, why didn't you stop me? Well, no. He helps us by helping us to reflect back on what I just said or what I just did. And then say, oh, yeah, I'll try to do something different next time, do better next time. I suppose we could also open it up and to everyone here and maybe share with us, the rest of us, some of the things that we had to learn by doing, making mistakes, or probably mostly not. Maybe some of the less harmful things, but something to think about too. All the things I had to learn, maybe they say the hard way, but there's some things that that's the only way we will get the point, is by having the experience of doing it. Say on the job training, yeah, there's a lot to be said there. I think all of us took courses. I took courses in accounting and said, yeah, I got all this down. And then I got on the job and figured, oh, okay, I'm gonna have to figure this out for myself. Take the general principles and try to apply it. And so experience, no matter what field it is, engineering or landscaping or whatever it might be, it's the real experience. And so we don't want to, God doesn't allow us to forfeit the opportunity to learn that way. And so as a parent too, we allow our children, and like this father did, to make a mistake. And it was a big mistake. And the third area that it comes out, it's not particularly new, but I think emphasizes one of the main points of this whole parable. That the Father and God runs to us because of love and compassion for us. In verse 17, it says, when the son came to his senses, he said, I will go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me one of your hired men. So the son got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. So there's a lot going on there. We know that it wasn't appropriate for older men especially to run in public. It was Aristotle that said great men never run in public. But the father's love was so strong, his compassion for his son, to see him coming back was so strong that he ran to him. But the thing to note, before he even ran, he saw him from a great distance, it says. He was a long ways off. Obviously had good eyesight, a whole lot better than mine. Probably didn't have glasses either. But he saw him and knew, that's my son. And he was obviously waiting, anticipating. Maybe every day he spent some time out there. This is the way he left. This is the way he's going to come back. He's going to come back one of these days. And we see this again. I look at this phrase. He had compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. His love was so great. It was so natural. I remember one time I was, I guess probably was on a Saturday weekend, and my son was like 10 years old, my youngest son. And we were just two of us were out driving, going to drive somewhere. I can remember the road I was driving on from our house. Maybe we were going to go check out the recent findings at the thrift store, because he liked to do stuff like that too. I was collecting a lot of stuff, books, music at that time. And I don't know what prompted. I just turned over and said, I says, Brian, do you know why I love you? Without skipping a beat. He said, because I'm your son. This is something God built within him. The father had this, obviously. He ran to his son. There's nothing that would have kept him back. Obviously, the son knew that the father loved him as well, because how could he come back and be willing to throw himself at the mercy of his father? The other example, similar to one I just gave about my own son, was Tim Hansel, who's one of my favorite Christian authors, has written a lot of books about Christian living, especially in relationship to a particular foundation that he was involved in. It was a leadership group of leading young men, children, through hiking and camping and doing rock climbing. It was pretty vigorous stuff, but through that, they were learning some Christian, manly, and maybe they're girls too, I don't know, I think it was mostly boys though, activities through hiking and and climbing rocks, very challenging things. One time he was out on a little hike with his son. I don't know how old he was, must have been pretty small, maybe 5 years old or so. And they were out, it was kind of maybe a rocky area and hills. And his son, he didn't really notice him there. And all of a sudden he heard his voice. He says, Dad, catch me. Well, after he said, catch me, he had already jumped. He had jumped from a ledge a little ways up from his dad. And he has had a time just to look up and react like he says, a circus acrobat to catch him in time. And he asked his son, Zach, what on earth inspired you to do something like that? Again, the quick response was, because you're my dad. He knew he would be caught. Isn't that what kids are? They have that kind of confidence in their parents and that kind of trust, that kind of love. Notice too that when the son came back, he actually had rehearsed a series of repentant comments. Forgive me, I sinned against you in heaven. Make me one of your hired servants. Actually, a hired servant was lower than a slave. A slave was a permanent part of the family. He was there. He was well cared for. A hired servant was there from day to day. He didn't know whether he was going to get a paycheck one day and then had nothing to do the next day, and he'd be on his own. So he wasn't asking for a very good position. Just a hired servant, have something to eat, something to do. Forget about being your son. But before the son even had a chance to say anything about his rehearsed speech, if you'll notice in the context, the father was there first. He ran out there, he embraced him, he kissed him, and the son hadn't said anything yet. He didn't say anything until after that. Oh, Father, I've sinned against you. Make me, one of your hired servants. But the father had already forgiven him. Father had already accepted him back. William Barclay says, This parable is not a parable of merit, but a picture of grace. That's what Jesus was that's why he gave us this parable. I think one of the main reasons, to learn what the Father is like, learn how much grace and pardon and love God gives towards us. One of the last points I want to bring out here was, why was the Father so excited to see his Son? Verse 24 gives us the answer. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. He didn't know whether he'd ever see his son again. To think about, to kind of maybe share a little bit with what this father went through, what the point that Jesus was illustrating here. Think about in our own lives. Has there ever been a time in your life when you experienced this maybe on a different level? You ever been in a grocery store when your kid was like 2 or 3 years old, toddler walking around? You think they're right there, you turn around, and they're not there. They're gone. You go to the next aisle, where'd they go? And you really start getting panicky, don't you? I've done that probably a few times. Then you see them, and there's all this relief, this joy, this excitement. Maybe not on this level yet, but that gives us some kind of an idea of what the Father was experiencing. Again, when I'm saying the Father here, it's not just a parable. The Father represents God. This is what God also feels when we come back to him. And then, of course, as I share the little, rather maybe more common experience of having lost your toddler in the store for a while, I know there are some of us who have gone through a potential loss that is 1,000 times greater than that. Even in the current life that we're living now, maybe in the last few years, 10, 20 years, we've had a child who was essentially lost. I'm not talking spiritually, morally. I'm talking on the streets. And you have no idea where they're at. You don't hear them from weeks or months. They have high risk factors in their life. Could mean, whether it's being taken advantage of, dying from substance abuse, or different situations. And then you see, maybe a few days you don't hear from them. And then you do. What a relief. It's like you don't care about what happened and why'd you allow me to go through this, even as a young adult. And the relief, the feeling of celebrating, the excitement. I get a taste, a little bit of what this father was going through. And I know people who've had children on the streets, young adults, for 6 months, for years, not knowing what's going on in their lives. I can't picture that kind of not knowing, that kind of uneasiness. That's a mild term for it, distress. So I asked the question, does God feel that way when we return to him? In fact, the same chapter, which Luke 15, it deals with 3 different kinds of examples of something that was lost and found. The lost sheep, there was the lost coin, and the lost son. Well, the lost sheep tells us what God feels about when something is lost and found. Verse 7, it says, I'm just paraphrasing it here, that when a man lost one of his sheep, he left the 99, he found it, and Jesus said, this is like, in heaven. When one sinner has repented, there's going to be more rejoicing in heaven over that one sinner who repented and returned than the 99 who remained faithful and stayed home. The last question, I may have said this 2 or 3 times. Why did Jesus give this parable in the first place? Well, as I said at the beginning, it's so we can learn more about our Father God, how God is like a father to us. how we are fathers to our children, or parents to our children. The answer, probably the most accurate question, if you're looking at the context of the scripture, is in the first 3 verses of Luke 15, before he even gave this parable. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around Jesus to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.' Then Jesus told them this parable." So right there's a context of why he told this parable, because they're accusing Jesus of living with and fellowshipping with, socializing with sinners, bad people, tax collectors, the worst of the worst of the worst. And sinners, of course, back in those days, the Pharisees defined sinners anyone who didn't believe what they believed, who didn't keep the law, who were probably Gentile. Any Gentile was considered a sinner. It's a broad category of people. And Jesus freely socialized with these folks. And so he gave this parable to show them, no matter what category you're in, what you consider a sinner, God is considered a son. He welcomes back, that he forgives. More than a lost sheep or a lost coin. The Father celebrates when he finds his son, just as we celebrate when we find our own children who might have been lost. So today we talked about fathers, sons, daughters, and especially God, who is our eternal Father. How blessed we are to have this precious relationship with him.